In my most recent episode, I discussed how Mars definitely needs to be the prize that we need to remain focused on when it comes to the Starship. This objective is what the Starship was designed for. This is the second home for mankind. This is our lifeboat to preserve the human species. But is this really the case? Although the majority of those who want to colonize the solar system are still focused on this planet, there is a powerful and growing minority that are starting to think that we've been looking in the wrong direction. Instead of further away from the sun, we should be looking closer in. Instead of looking towards Mars, we should be looking towards Venus. And although when I was a kid, this is a notion that nobody would have thought of, most of us know at this point that there is a region of Venus that is actually extremely hospitable to human life. Well, as far as non-Earth planets in the solar system are concerned. And of course, this is the Venusian atmosphere. There is a region of the atmosphere of Venus that is actually quite habitable, both in terms of temperature, in terms of pressure, and many other factors. And this fact has not been lost on NASA. For a long time now, NASA has been looking at exploring the upper atmosphere of Venus, not just with probes, but with a manned expedition. But of course, where NASA is looking to explore, other people are looking at the possibility of permanent habitation. But getting back to NASA, according to recent plans, which I've discussed in previous episodes, it would appear that they are looking to go to Venus first, to discover what interplanetary journeys would be like on an easier target, and believe it or not, they regard Venus as being an easier target. And this could actually help Elon Musk as well, in terms of his ambitions to colonize Mars. This may seem counterintuitive. There couldn't be two planets more different in the solar system than Mars and Venus, but actually, Venus could be very helpful to Elon Musk and his long-term plans. How? Well, we're going to discover that in just a few minutes. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Angry Astronaut. On a couple of occasions, I've discussed Venus on this channel, partially as an avenue to getting to Mars, using it as a gravitational slingshot, sometimes as a stop-off point, or perhaps NASA's next objective for exploration. But I've never really talked about Venus in terms of colonization, nor have I gone into really great detail on what NASA has planned. And that's because in the past, NASA's plans for Venus, at least as far as manned expeditions were concerned, was something that they didn't really have on the books. But now they do. The HAVOC, as it is called, the High Altitude Venus Operational Concept, is something that they apparently intend to do before Mars, as sort of another dress rehearsal, an easier interplanetary journey that will have a lot of objectives, a lot of things that they can gain out of this mission as a precursor to traveling to Mars. But how could this fit in with SpaceX? I mean, Elon Musk has always wanted to go to Mars. It seems to be the most ideal place for a second home for the human species. Venus, to paraphrase Carl Sagan, is as close to hell as any planet in our solar system. Its pressures at the surface are hundreds of atmospheres, enough to crush just about anything, and all of the probes that we have sent there have died in very short order. The temperatures at the surface are hot enough to melt lead, and in addition to that, the clouds are full of sulfuric acid. It seems like the craziest place to establish a colony. And if I had suggested establishing a colony there 10, 20 years ago, probably would have had a room for me at some asylum. But since that time, a lot has changed. We've learned a lot of new things about Venus. And not only is there a region of Venus that we could potentially colonize, but also an expedition to this planet could actually help Elon Musk in his ambitions to go to Mars. How is this possible? Well, I'm going to talk about that right now. Venus has been a compelling object in our night sky probably from the moment that the human species decided to look up. Its high albedo makes it the brightest object in the heavens, aside, of course, from the sun and the moon. It has a similar size and similar gravity to the Earth, and it orbits just a little closer to the sun, and it is shrouded in mysterious clouds, which in the 19th century led scientists to believe all kinds of crazy things about this planet. That it was a steamy jungle, that there were dinosaurs or something along those lines. As Carl Sagan said, observation, you can't see a thing. Conclusion, dinosaurs. Now that being said, there is compelling evidence that Venus at one time was very much like Earth, that it possibly harbored life, and perhaps it still does. We'll get to that a little bit later, but at that point, the similarities between the two planets end. The surface of Venus is a disturbing example of what happens when you have a runaway greenhouse effect. 96% of the planet's atmosphere is comprised of carbon dioxide, which, as we all know, is a greenhouse gas. Consequently, the pressure at the surface is 92 times that of Earth, which is about the same as being 900 meters underwater, which is sufficient to crush most submarines. And on top of that, it has a temperature of 464 degrees Celsius, which I mentioned before is sufficient to melt lead. Now, the sickly yellow lightning may or may not take place. There is some debate about that, but one thing is certain. The clouds of Venus are full of sulfuric acid, and on top of that, the atmosphere can become extremely violent, with winds sometimes exceeding 400 kilometers per hour. But it was the Vega probes, which were deployed in the mid-1980s with the intention of going to Halley's Comet, that actually revealed what we currently are interested in on Venus. And these probes deployed balloons with instrument packs into the Venusian atmosphere. Now, the Vega balloons were deployed at the end at an altitude of about 50 kilometers, regardless of what this Soviet film might tell you, although an updraft carried them to a higher altitude a lot more quickly than they anticipated, and then very powerful winds carried the probes around the planet. Now, the probes discovered a lot of things that were anticipated, such as a high amount of carbon dioxide, sulfuric acid in the clouds, along with a lot of other toxic elements, but also they determined that the pressure and the temperature of this part of the atmosphere was very similar to Earth. Now, these probes accomplished amazing things, but they also piss me off. Why? Because they were two of several probes sent by every major space agency on the planet to explore Halley's Comet, whereas NASA did not, because the cost of a NASA probe to Halley's Comet, which doesn't come very often by the way, would cost the same as one B-1 strategic bomber. And by the way, at the time, we had 100 planned, and for some reason we couldn't do with 99. So while the Soviets got the scientific knowledge and the national prestige of exploring Halley's Comet, which they could put on a postage stamp, we got 100 of these, one of which, by the way, crashed the very following year in a training accident at the cost of 3 lives. I was pissed about it then, and I'm pissed about it now. But thanks to the Vega probes, it has become apparent that although Venus is extremely hostile at the surface, the upper atmosphere is sufficiently similar to our own planet to not only consider an expedition, not only to consider a manned scientific expedition, but actually to consider colonization. No, it's not as similar as this to our planet, but nevertheless, the Venusian atmosphere is becoming more and more attractive all the time. Almost 20 years later, the European Space Agency sent the Venus Express to gather more information about the climate and the surface of the planet. Aside from carrying out aerobraking maneuvers, the probe remained in orbit for over 9 years, gathering very comprehensive details of the planet's atmosphere, its surface, its climate, and many, many other things about this planet which we simply did not know prior to this. And as we gathered this information, NASA was watching. And thus was the HAVOC mission born, being comprised of 2 trans-Venus injection stages. One that travels to Venus to transfer the crew from one vehicle to the other, the second vehicle containing all of the equipment necessary to explore the Venusian atmosphere, and the first vehicle just carrying the crew, which means the Starship could actually carry the crew to the second stage, which enters the Venusian atmosphere and deploys a dirigible. Now, instead of containing helium, the dirigible could actually contain breathable atmosphere because it's lighter than CO2. It would have solar panels on the top and be comprised of Teflon, which is proven to be the most resistant to sulfuric acid. Now, by the way, this mission would be preceded by a robotic dirigible just to make sure that the concept works, and a 30-day orbiting mission to orbit Venus to determine if the interplanetary part is functional. But once all of this was done, the dirigible would spend 30 days in the Venusian atmosphere, being carried along by the powerful winds, essentially creating its own days of about 44 hours apiece. Now, this is important because the Venusian day is about as long as its year, but then the ascent element would take the crew back up to the Venusian transfer ship, which is designed to return to Earth. Once again, this could be done on the Starship and would not require an additional vehicle of this configuration. Once the ship returned to Earth, you could carry out an Earth version of the Starship suicide dive, or simply have the crew transfer to the Orion capsule and have it re-enter the atmosphere, depending on what you preferred. Now, I found some very damn interesting coincidences about this mission. First of all, the trans-Venus injection stage weighs in at 109.4 tons, or just under 100 metric tons, or the Starship's capability to carry to low Earth orbit. That's the first interesting coincidence. The other interesting coincidences that I found is that the ascent vehicle plus the ascent habitat plus the atmospheric habitat plus the airship all adds up to a little less than 100 metric tons, or, coincidentally, about the total mass that the Starship can carry to low Earth orbit. And oh yeah, there's another interesting coincidence. Look at the phases of the mission. Phase 1 is robotic, as I mentioned before. Phase 2 is 30 days in orbit. Phase 3 is a 30-day mission in the atmosphere by a crew. Phase 4 is 1 year in the atmosphere. And Phase 5 is permanent human presence. Just like on Mars, NASA is looking at long-term human habitation. So how again does the Starship work into all of this? And more importantly, how does this mission fit in with Elon Musk's plans? Well, first of all, the heavy lift capacity of the Starship and its per kilogram rate would allow such heavy vehicles to be transported to low Earth orbit to make their way to Venus at a very low cost compared to the billion-dollar apiece SLS. So each trans-Venus ejection stage could essentially be launched for about $2 million apiece. The ships themselves would cost a whole lot more. So a series of 3 or perhaps 4 Starship launches to low Earth orbit would be sufficient to send everything that HAVOC would need into low Earth orbit in order to make its journey to Venus. However, if you use the Starship to actually provide some of the transportation, then only one trans-Venus injection stage plus the equipment would be required. This, of course, would require also that the Starship have several low Earth orbit refuelings. Nevertheless, it would be definitely worth it given the expense of another trans-Venus injection stage. Doing things this way, you could have one trans-Venus injection stage with the airship, ascent vehicle, ascent habitat, and so on making its way to Venus, while the Starship handles everything else. This would be a far less expensive and efficient way of carrying out the mission. Okay, so this might be good for NASA, but what about SpaceX? Well, as you can see from this delta V map, it takes less delta V to get to low Venusian orbit than it takes to go all the way to Mars. Now, of course, you can cut out that last portion of the Mars journey with the Starship suicide dive, as I like to call it, but you can eliminate that process entirely by just going to low Venusian orbit and letting the trans-Venus ship take care of the rest of it. And this map more clearly shows that not only is the journey shorter, but if anything goes wrong along the way, an abort will be a much shorter and easier process than trying to abort from Mars. It would take a month or 2 as opposed to 6 months or years depending on the positioning of the 2 planets. Now, a shorter journey means less time in microgravity, but it also means more time in gravity that's similar to that of Earth, almost exactly the same, actually. On top of that, the Venusian atmosphere would provide almost complete protection from radiation, which is a consistent problem with Mars colonization. Also, since the Venusian atmosphere is comprised almost entirely of carbon dioxide, an automated Starship in orbit while the HAVOC mission is going on below could execute a few aerobraking attempts in a carbon dioxide atmosphere, that is to say, the upper atmosphere of Venus, while testing out their heat panels and everything else that they would need to test out for a future Mars suicide dive, without the possibility of a sudden impact at the end. And finally, what can be done on Venus can also be done on Mars. A Mars dirigible would be different, however, because the interior would have to be comprised of a vacuum, given the extreme thinness of the Martian atmosphere, but the principle would still be the same, allowing an airship to carry very large amounts of cargo from one part of Mars to the other, rather than trying to create some kind of Mars plane that simply is not designed to travel in such a thin atmosphere. But it is the prospect of Venusian colonization that I find to be the most exciting. Because of the pressures, because of the protection from radiation, this environment may prove to be far more friendly to human habitation than Mars is. You wouldn't even need a spacesuit here. All you'd need is some kind of suit that was resistant to sulfuric acid, perhaps made of the same kind of Kevlar that was tested for the Venusian dirigibles, and an oxygen supply, and that's about it. A rip in your suit would not be nearly as deadly as a rip in your suit on Mars would be. Instead of modular surface habitats, you would have modular floating habitats, dwelling in a place where humans have never lived before. And not only that, because of the similarity in the gravity, you would have the luxury of being able to return to Earth if you wanted to, without suffering the adverse effects of the bone degradation and other drawbacks of a low gravity environment. But there are some serious drawbacks. First, the weather, which can be extremely violent, and the complete absence of water. In a solar system full of water, Venus is incredibly dry, and the number of C-class asteroids in close proximity to Venus that might be mined for water are in very short supply and would be difficult to access. Water would probably be the most valuable substance to a Venusian colony. Nevertheless, Venus remains a very compelling place for at least a trial run for an interplanetary journey, and I've barely even touched on the fact that those gray streaks in the atmosphere, when subjected to spectrographic analyses, appear to be full of bacterial life. We're not certain about that yet, but it's entirely possible that the first place that we will discover extraterrestrial life will not be on Mars, but on this, our twin world, which might be more similar to our planet than we ever thought. You know, it's been a little while since I've gotten pissed off on this channel, at least properly pissed off, but I am now. If a vacuum dirigible or airship is such a good aerial reconnaissance vehicle on Mars, if it could be used and travel to hundreds of kilometers worth of distance without any difficulty whatsoever, at least in comparison to some of the other ideas we've had, why the hell did we not send one on the Perseverance? Why instead did we send a helicopter? And I really don't understand how the designers of the Perseverance, who are very intelligent people, let this idea get by them. That having been said, there's a whole lot of things about Venus I think you've noticed in this episode that make it very, very good for a colony. Between the atmospheric pressures, the temperature, the gravity, the protection from the radiation, there's lots of things that arguably make it better than Mars. And on top of that, lots of other things, as you've noticed in the video, that are going to help Elon Musk in terms of being successful in establishing a colony on Mars. However, there is one fatal Achilles heel for Venus, and that is the apparent complete lack of water. That is something that is going to completely doom the concept of a self-sustaining colony. Sure, we can resupply a small colony on a regular basis with the Starship, but until we're able to produce our own water on Venus, a colony there will never be self-sustaining, especially a colony of 1 million people. The life that may have evolved on Venus might have adapted to having no water, as we have seen, but we humans certainly need it. We need it to breathe, we obviously need it to drink, and we need it for most of our types of rocket fuel, including nuclear thermal propulsion if we go that route. And this, in my opinion, dooms a Venus colony, not the engineering of making a city float, not the other nasty aspects of the surface temperature. All of these things can be dealt with. It's the absence of water that's going to be the biggest problem. And the fact, as we've seen in the video, that there are so few asteroids, C-class or otherwise, that orbit close to Venus, even asteroid mining might be very difficult in terms of trying to provide a colony with the necessary water. In any event, perhaps somebody will come up with a solution, or perhaps we will find a source of water on Venus that we didn't think of. The sulfuric acid can be converted into water with extreme difficulty, but it's not very practical. Really, when it comes down to it, we humans are better suited to a planet that has water, no matter how many other negatives it might have. In any event, and I just said that again, but I have to talk about this again. The dreaded Starliner coffee cup. Still sitting there. I'm closing in on 20,000 subscribers. I actually hope I get there by the time this video airs, or that I'm very close to it. But I'm shooting for 40,000. Otherwise, this hated thing is going to keep sitting there next to the Crew Dragon, and I can't wait to blow it apart. So please like, please subscribe, and please support this channel in any way that you can if you want to continue seeing content like this as regularly as I tend to pump it out. And as you know, I tend to put out a lot of content pretty quickly. But until we're getting ready to make our journey beyond the moon and making our selection for our first planet in the solar system, which may very well be Venus, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.